This is Revelation chapter 16, the vials of wrath poured out, part 5. Now we come to the second vial of wrath, and you will note that the first vial was poured out upon the earth. The second is now poured out upon the sea. The first 4 vials are in fact following the same pattern as that of the first 4 trumpets of Revelation chapter 8. And there we saw the effect of the first trumpet directed towards the earth, and then the second trumpet was directed toward the sea. If you recall, under the second trumpet we saw the navies of Imperial Rome being wiped out by the Vandals, and now we are going to see the navies of Papal Europe destroyed, and this takes us to the time of great naval warfare which sprang from the French Revolution during the period 1793 to 1815. And we read in Revelation 16 verse 3, "And the second angel poured out his vial upon the sea, and it became as the blood of a dead man, and every living soul died in the sea." And for anybody that is new to listening to this Revelation series, I want to again point out the language of prophecy, the language of the prophets. When we are told that the sea became as blood and every living soul died in the sea, we have to understand that this cannot be literal. For if the sea became as literal blood, not only would every living soul die in the sea, but all life on the planet would cease in short order. This is symbolic language that is being used in the Bible. It's used consistently throughout the Bible, and in this case it is dealing with the sphere of action being the sea, becoming the place that would see tremendous conflict, carnage and death. And this is in its context specifically directed towards Papal Europe. This time in history pitted Protestant England, who had embraced the open Bible and the Reformation, against Roman Catholic Europe for mastery of the seas, and it was Papal Europe that was roundly defeated in battle after battle. And here we have listed a number of the great naval battles from this period. In 1793, the greater part of the French fleet was destroyed at Toulon by Lord Hood. In 1794, Lord Howe's victory over the French off Ushant, and then the taking of Corsica and nearly all the Spanish and French West Indian islands. In 1795, Lord Bridgeport's naval victory and capture of the Cape of Good Hope, and also soon after that the defeat of the French and Dutch fleet sent to retake it. In 1797, there was victory over the Spanish fleet off Cape St. Vincent, and that off Camperdown over the Dutch. 1798, Lord Nelson's victory of the Nile. 1801, Lord Nelson's victory of Copenhagen. 1805, Lord Nelson defeats both the combined forces of the Spanish and French fleets at Trafalgar. Eliot says in the Horae Apocalypticae Volume 3, "Altogether in this naval war, from its beginning in 1793 to its end in 1815, it appears from James's naval victory that there were destroyed near 200 ships of the line, between 300 and 400 frigates, and an almost incalculable number of smaller vessels of war and ships of commerce. It is most truly stated by Dr. Keith that the whole history of the world does not present such a period of naval war, destruction and bloodshed. In the figurative language of the prophecy, quote, 'the sea became as the blood of a dead man,' end quote." Here we see an image of a French medal that was struck to commemorate the construction of 2,000 barks, or invasion barges, in 1804, which Napoleon commanded to be constructed for the immediate invasion of England. This medal shows Hercules standing over and strangling the Nemean lion. The Nemean lion is a vicious creature of Greek mythology which was eventually killed by Hercules, and so the thought is that the French would kill the English lion, and this was Napoleon's expectation, and of course it was the French who were totally defeated, leaving the English as rulers of the sea. Around the edge of the medal we can see the French words which referred to the building of the 2,000 barks. Ship and boat builders across the coast of France were put to this task with the port of Bologna as the staging point for the invasion. However, the construction of these flat-bottom boats proved to be impractical for crossing the rough seas of the Channel, and additionally, Napoleon's plans for conquest by sea met their doom in 1805, when the combined French and Spanish fleets were destroyed by the British under Lord Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar, as we have previously mentioned. The barks were built, but they never set sail for their intended purpose. The revolutionary spirit of France, combined with the destruction of the maritime power of Papal Europe, which was principally held by France, Spain, and Portugal, resulted in the loss of many of the colonies held by those countries, as they also threw off the yoke of their masters. For example, the Spanish colonies of South America were lost, the Isle of Haiti or Saint Domingo, which was the most flourishing of the French colonies, was lost, and the Brazils separated from Portugal, and so the prediction was completed, and in this sense the Papal European colonies became symbolically dead to Papal Europe. And for your information, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that the picture that has been behind the last few slides is John Bull, who represents England, and he's swallowing up the French fleet, and this is at the Battle of the Nile. It is of interest to note that England is known as, or is identified as, John Bull, and if you understand Bible prophecy and the ancestry of these people, how that they are lineally descendant from the house of Israel who were taken into the Assyrian captivities, as recorded in the Bible and in history, you would also know that Israel was represented in the Bible as a wild ox or a bull, sometimes also called a unicorn, but the word behind unicorn in the Bible simply means a bull. The heraldry of a nation is a pointer to the history of that nation and its ancestry, and John Bull is only one of a great multitude of things found in the heraldry of the English-speaking people that points to their ancestry from the house of Israel. And if you would like further information on this aspect of things, please make sure that you view my series on the two houses of Israel, as that will provide you with many of the details from the Word of God. And before we move to the third vial, let's look at the timeline again to see the progression from the first vial to the second vial as shown here. Now we come to the third vial. In Revelation 16 verse 4 we read, "And the third angel poured out his vial upon the rivers and fountains of waters, and they became blood." The third vial continues to follow the pattern set by the previous two and their relationship to the four trumpets of Revelation 8. Just as under the third trumpet, judgment had come upon the alpine regions, the river valleys and fountains of waters, especially those of northern Italy during the breakup of the old Roman Empire, so now in like manner judgment comes upon the same areas, but this time by the hand of Napoleon Bonaparte, as he looked to assert French influence and atheistic philosophy over the rest of Latin Europe. Now Napoleon said, "I will prove to be an Attila to Venice." Now again, this ties in with the nature of the third trumpet given in Revelation chapter 8 that gave us Attila the Hun attacking the Western Roman Empire in this very same region. And I'm going to leave it up to you to go back to Revelation chapter 8 to refresh your memory on this if need be. This is a subtle but nonetheless important point to take into account, as it once again demonstrates that we have a more sure word of prophecy, we have the right people in the right place at the right time, we have the correct key to fit the lock, and this is not just something that seems to fit as though some other event might fit easily as well. Far from it. We have the right key to open the right lock, and with this we can have confidence that the interpretation of the prophecy is correct. In the book The History of Napoleon Bonaparte, Volume 1 by John Gibson Lockhart, the author refers to Napoleon Bonaparte and says, "the destined scourge of God, who it was hopeless to resist." Now, the thing that is significant about this quote is that it was Attila the Hun who is most well known in history as the scourge of God, and we looked at that when we examined the third trumpet of Revelation chapter 8. So again, the interrelationship between the trumpets of Revelation 8 and the judgment of the old Roman Empire, and now Revelation chapter 16 and the judgment of the papal Roman Empire, again demonstrates that the historicist approach to Bible prophecy is correct. Albert Barnes said in his book Notes Explanatory and Practical on the Book of Revelation this: "One has only to look upon a map of northern Italy to see that there is no such other portion of the world which would more naturally be suggested when speaking of a country abounding in rivers and fountains of water." And this is the map to which Albert Barnes refers. And if you have the time, you can look at this and you'll find too many rivers to name here. Not to mention that around all of this we find the Po River, Danube, the Rhine, and the Rhone. So revolutionary France waged war in the very localities once wasted by the Huns, as we saw under the third trumpet. And then this area later became the place where so many of the worst atrocities were perpetrated by Roman Catholic Europe and their armies against the Protestants, or heretics so-called. The valleys of the Rhine, Danube, and Alpine streams of Italy had witnessed the martyrdom of hundreds of thousands of Waldensians, Albigensians, Vaudois, Hussites, Moravians, Lutherans, Reformers, and Huguenots, and now God was meting out divine judgment. And so this again became the same place where God poured out judgment upon them that had the mark of the beast and upon them which worshipped his image. In the Horae Apocalypticae, Volume 3, Eliot says, "It was in April 1792 that war was declared by the French National Assembly against the German Emperor, in the September following against the King of Sardinia, and ere the close of that year, it resulted that both the Rhine began to be notable as one fateful scene of the outpouring of this vial of blood, and that advance was made by the French towards a second scene destined to suffer under it, the Alpine streams of Piedmont and Lombardy." We read in the annals of that year of the French and Austrian armies conflicting at Mentz and Worms and Spires, all situated on the middle Rhine, the very towns that Attila long before desolated, of other armies conflicting in the Austrian Netherlands, watered by the Meuse, the last tributary of the lower Rhine, and also of a third French army advancing into Savoy as far as the foot of the Piedmontese Alpine frontier. Further along, Eliot speaks of the first Italian campaign of Bonaparte against the allied Sardinians and Austrians, and says, "Its course is to be traced from Alpine river to river, along the whole of the north of Italy, from Coni on the Stura to Venice. In the progress of the contest, every river was made a position and battlefield. The Alpine fountains of water were indeed turned into blood," and Eliot goes on and on, talking about the battles raging in and around the rivers and fountains of water. Let's not forget that the ultimate and final day of the Lord is coming. And when he deals with his enemies finally and for all time, when he metes out divine retribution, it's not going to be a picnic. In Daniel chapter 2, the stone hits the feet of the image, and the whole edifice of human government, which is still perpetuated today in the Fourth World Empire, this whole edifice collapses and is smashed to pieces, and the wind blows the whole thing away. The wicked are raised up very high today. They run our governments, our monetary system, the education system, and the rest of it, including Big Pharma. and the mass vaccination, so-called, being forced on billions of people on the earth. God's not caught off guard. He's on the throne, as we have seen in Revelation 4 and 5, and when the time comes, the wicked are going to be destroyed from off the earth. They're going to be taken away, and the righteous shall remain. The righteous aren't going anywhere. The righteous stay here, and the wicked are taken away. Amen. The meek shall inherit the earth. It's not going to be turned over to a one-man antichrist to make a nuisance of himself for 7 years. That's hogwash. That's the stuff of futurism that was taught by the Church of Rome. The only ones who are going to be taken away are the wicked. Now, as it stands today, very few Christians have the oil of illumination, so they don't understand these things, and many are going to be found lacking, as is shown in the parable of the 10 virgins. But let us do our part to spread the oil of understanding while it is yet day, for the night cometh in which no man can work. And before I move to the 4th file, let's look at the progression of the timeline to see how things are moving along. And clearly there is a lot of action overlaying itself with all that is unfolding. And now we come to the 4th vial of wrath, Revelation 16 verse 8. And the 4th angel poured out his vial upon the sun, and power was given unto him to scorch men with fire. And men were scorched with great heat, and blasphemed the name of God, which hath power over these plagues, and they repented not to give him glory. Once again, we can see the pattern of the first 4 vials following that of the first 4 trumpets. In Revelation chapter 8, with the sounding of the 4th trumpet, a third part of the sun, moon and stars were smitten. And now in Revelation chapter 16, with the 4th vial, we have that poured out upon the sun. Both are dealing with the heavenly bodies. As we know, the sun is the brightest luminary in the heavens, and in Bible prophecy this symbolizes the most conspicuous ruler in the political heavens, and at this time this is either going to represent the Pope of the day, or the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and of Germany, or Napoleon Bonaparte himself. If we view the sun in verse 8 as the Pope or the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, then the vial is to be viewed as being poured out against them. And in fact, their lights were darkened as they lost power, and this is covered off in verse 10, where we see the 5th angel pouring out his vial upon the seat of the beast, and his kingdom becoming full of darkness. Alternatively, if we view the sun as Napoleon Bonaparte himself, then we can see that his sun shone the brightest. He made and crowned himself Emperor of France in 1804. He was given great power. He took over essentially the Holy Roman Empire and became the kingmaker, and in fact appointed his brothers as rulers in various parts of Europe, and he also scorched men with fire, as the historical record shows. The period in view here could be taken as starting with the French Revolution, when Napoleon's sun started to rise from the horizon, or perhaps from 1804 when he made himself emperor, and then the period would end in AD 1815. Now, Eliot points out, without being dogmatic, that the scorching of men with fire mentioned in verse 8 could be taken as an allusion to artillery that was used by the French emperor, which was used to an extent beyond all former example in military annals as the great arm of his victories. Now, if you recall, we saw a similar example of this under the 6th trumpet and the fall of Constantinople, which was achieved through the use of artillery. In addition, Eliot points out that Napoleon became known as Sultan Kabir, which means ruler of fire, and this was the title he gained from his Egyptian campaign, which campaign, of course, failed. From oxfordreference.com we read the following concerning Napoleon Bonaparte. It says, Emperor of the French, 1804 to 14. By the age of 26 he was a general and placed in supreme command of the campaign against Sardinia and Austria in Italy, 1796 to 97. This provided him with some of the most spectacular victories of his military career and resulted in the creation of the French-controlled Cisalpine Republic in northern Italy. In 1798, he led an army to Egypt, intending to create a French empire overseas and to threaten the British overland route to India. And of course, we know he was defeated by the British in that expedition. The article goes on. Elected first consul for 10 years, he became the supreme ruler of France. During the next 4 years, he began his reorganization of the French legal system and education. In 1804, Napoleon crowned himself the Emperor of the French and embarked on a series of campaigns known as the Napoleonic Wars, and it is this period in particular which is in view under the third vial. And concerning his coronation, as a very important symbol of his legitimacy to rule and his power, Napoleon had Pope Pius VII brought in to officiate at his coronation as emperor. But at the moment of his crowning, when the Pope said, "Receive the imperial crown," Napoleon turned, removed his laurel wreath, and crowned himself with his back to the Pope. And in so doing, Napoleon was symbolizing that he was becoming emperor based on his own merits and the will of the people, not because of some authority vested in the Pope. The authority of the Church of Rome in France was over. From Henry Grattan Guinness's book, History Unveiling Prophecy, under the section dealing with the French Revolution stage, we read this. With the rise of Napoleon, the French Revolution took on a new character and became the scourge of Europe. The armies of France were now led on an unparalleled career of conquest by that man who was the most, quote, gigantic manifestation of mental power and despotic will, end quote, the world has ever seen. Arrogant, unscrupulous, selfish, remorseless, ambitious, self-reliant, with indomitable vigour, unwearying energy, marvellous military genius, surpassing administrative ability, uniting a lofty comprehensive intellect with utter disregard for moral considerations, Napoleon sacrificed the lives of millions, overturned the thrones of Europe, revived the empire of Charlemagne, and strove to obtain the monarchy of the world. From Alexander Keith's work, The Signs of the Times as Denoted by Fulfillment of Historical Predictions, Volume 2, we read, within the space of 8 years, he scorched every kingdom in Europe, from Naples to Berlin, and from Lisbon to Moscow. Ancient kingdoms withered before the intense blaze of his power. Like the sun, there was nothing hid from his great heat, and the exercise of his power was the misery of millions. B.W. Johnson, in his book Vision of the Ages, says, from 1796 to 1815, he was engaged in war without a moment's cessation. He converted Europe into a great camp, and every nation was blackened and torn with wars. From Spain to Moscow, from Egypt to Holland, the march of his armies left behind a track of blood. In his wars, it is estimated that 2 million men perished by the sword, and none can tell of the want and misery and despair that brooded over the bleeding and desolated lands that were tracked by his armies. There was hardly a home in Europe that did not suffer, hardly one that was not in mourning for slain fathers, brothers and sons, or for wives and daughters. And to get an idea of the sufferings of the non-combatant inhabitants of Papal Europe, those that had the mark of the beast and which had worshipped his image, we read the following from this book called The Campaigns of 1812, 1813 and 1814 by James McQueen. This: the destruction and distress which marked the country through which the French army fled from the bloody fields of Leipzig was altogether indescribable. Dead bodies covered the roads. Half-consumed French soldiers were found in the ruins of villages. destroyed by the flames. Whole districts were depopulated by disease. Every kind of property was destroyed. Every living creature abandoned these melancholy spots. For a month after the retreat, said the Prussian camp paper number 10, dated Frankfurt, November 9th, 1813, quote, no human being, no domestic animal, no poultry, nay, not even a sparrow was to be met with, only ravens in abundance feeding on corpses were seen, end quote. But it is unnecessary to dwell on this heart-rending subject. Suffice it to say that similar was the situation of all that part of Europe, extending from Moscow to Mayence, a distance of 1,450 miles. From Walter Scott's book, The Life of Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, etc., Volume 2, we read the following. The French army was poured into some foreign country by forced marches, without any previous arrangement of stores or magazines for their maintenance, and with the purpose of maintaining them solely at the expense of the inhabitants. Bonaparte was exercised in this system, and the combination of great masses, by means of such forced marches, was one great principle of his tactics. This species of war was carried on at the least possible expense of money to his treasury, but it was necessarily at the greatest possible expenditure of human life and the incalculable increase of human misery. Napoleon's usual object was to surprise the enemy by the rapidity of his marches, defeat him in some great battle, and then seize upon his capital, levy contributions, make a peace with such advantages as he could obtain, and finally return to Paris. When the army marched through a thinly peopled country, or when the national character and perhaps local facilities encouraged the natives and peasants to offer resistance, then the soldiers became animated alike by the scarcity of provisions and irritated at the danger which they sometimes incurred in collecting them. As their hardships increased, their temper became relentless and reckless, and besides indulging in every other species of violence, they increased their own distresses by destroying what they could not use. Famine and sickness were not long of visiting an army which traversed by forced marches a country exhausted of provisions. Without hospitals and without magazines, every straggler who could not regain his ranks fell a victim to hunger, to weather, to weariness, to the vengeance of an incensed peasantry. In this manner the French army suffered woes which, till these tremendous wars, had never been the lot of troops in hostilities carried on between civilized nations. Still, Bonaparte's object was gained. He attained, amid these losses and sacrifices, and at the expense of them, the point which he had desired. In this online article dealing with how should murderous dictators be remembered by Doug Bandow, we read the following. The Napoleonic Wars, a name that well captures the emperor's culpability, ran for a dozen years, from 1803 to 1815. No one knows how many people died in the seemingly perpetual conflicts, the truly endless wars of their time, but estimates range up to 7 million. France, Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Spain, and Portugal each lost more than 100,000 soldiers, some multiples more. Total combat deaths probably ran between 2.5 million and 3.5 million. Civilian deaths were substantial as well, but the range of estimates is far wider, from 750,000 to 3 million. And so the fourth angel poured out his vial upon the sun, and power was given unto him to scorch men with fire, and millions of men, women, and children suffered and died during this dreadful period. Yet there was no repentance, as it says in verse 9. The system that was the midwife, that brought to full term the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars and everything that went with that would not change, but rather, as it says in verse 9, and men were scorched with great heat and blasphemed the name of God, which hath power over these plagues, and they repented not to give him glory. And just before we end, here is the progression of the timeline so far, up to and including the 4th vial. This is the end of Revelation chapter 16, part 5. In the next part, I will be looking at the 5th vial.